I had been seeing things on television that annoyed and irritated me for a long time before I seriously considered giving it up, and even once begun, it would take a while for me to reach the conclusion that it was finally time to literally pull the plug. But one thing that happened in the final stages of that decision was the reading of a couple books. You see, many a news show has occasional brief segments about fitness, and many a popular magazine has articles on the same subject. But the thing is, these segments and articles are profoundly unhelpful, but you can't tell until you hit the books. In reading 2 books on the subject of general fitness, one can expect to learn more on the subject than one can ever possibly hope to learn from television, and at this point one begins to notice just how incredibly overblown and misleading commercials for the latest revolutionary gizmo tend to be. Let me just take a moment to digress long enough to append that once one has read 4 books on the subject, one has probably obtained all the knowledge on the subject one has any use for, unless one plans to train as a professional athlete, or help someone else to. But back to the subject. Once you've done that, you begin to see just how incredibly sneaky advertisers are about the latest gizmo. Notice that they never actually go as far as to outright say that the product in question will have this result. They just suggest it. They imply it over and over again. So if you buy it, you try it, and it doesn't have the desired result, or there's a detail to making it work that wasn't mentioned in the commercial that would have prevented you from buying it had you known about it, they're not on the hook for anything. Watching an ad for such a gizmo or a news spot on the subject, one is absolutely awestruck. Having read these books on the subject and subsequently operating from a foundation of some understanding of it, one realizes just how unimpressive the commercial is. But one also realizes how impressive it would have appeared if one hadn't done this reading and obtained this understanding first. Realizing the difference between the two can be a most startling experience. Of course, as it happens over and over again, realization sets in that all the time one spent watching those news spots was essentially wasted. That was time one could have spent doing something else, something productive. One realizes how much of a sucker one used to be, and one begins to wonder how much of a sucker one still is. Then one realizes that television will never answer this question, while books probably will. Here are a few things that television never explained, to me at least, on the subject of fitness. First, the #1 priority of any fitness regimen is injury prevention. This is why every fitness guide and piece of fitness equipment comes with a disclaimer advising you to have a doctor check you over before you begin. There are certain fitness practices that aren't very obvious, that practically invite injury, and one must make it a point not to lose sight of these considerations as one pursues one's goals. Second, every component of fitness has 3 main considerations: frequency, intensity, and time. This is what's called the FIT formula. In each of these respects, if you underdo it, you won't derive a benefit, but if you overdo it, you can do yourself more harm than good. Take stretching, for example. The frequency is 3 to 7 times per week. If you're stretching less than 3 times per week, you're wasting your time. But if you're stretching any given muscle more than 7 times per week, you're most likely inviting injury. Now let me stress that when I say 3 times per week, I mean distributed evenly across the week. I'm talking about an arrangement with stretching on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, not Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday and taking the rest of the week off. The intensity is to stretch a muscle just the barest hint beyond the point at which discomfort first sets in. Not pain, discomfort. If you're experiencing pain when you stretch, you're probably overdoing it, but if you're not experiencing a little discomfort in the muscle being stretched, you're underdoing it. The length of time to hold a stretch is 15 seconds to 2 minutes. In each of these considerations, when you're first getting started on a regimen, or if you're content where you are and you're not trying to increase your flexibility, I recommend sticking to the low end. Or take cardio, for example. The frequency is 3 to 6 times per week, again distributed evenly across the week. I've seen some sources that say 3 to 6 times per week, but I recommend taking that with a grain of salt. If you get to the point where you're doing it 5 times per week, and you feel like you can do more, that's the time to consider experimenting with 1 more day. The intensity is into your training heart rate range, which is kind of a tricky thing to calculate. First, you need to calculate your max heart rate, which is 220 minus your age. That's simple enough. Second, you need to measure your resting heart rate. Some morning when you wake up without an alarm, or the need to get out of bed promptly, that's a good time to measure that. Before you've applied yourself to any exertion greater than finding your pulse, find it and count the number of times it beats in a minute. That's your resting heart rate. Next, you need to calculate your working heart rate. This is your max heart rate minus your resting heart rate. Next, 50% of working heart rate plus resting heart rate gives you the lower end of your training range, and 85% of working heart rate plus resting heart rate gives you the higher end. There's also a simpler equation out there, which is the basis for the chart that a lot of gyms have displayed on their treadmills and elliptical machines, but I don't like that chart or that equation, because neither accounts for one's given level of aerobic fitness. I figure the more aerobically fit one is, the lower one's resting heart rate is going to be, and this method I have just shared accounts for that. The time is 20 to 60 minutes. I've seen one source that said 15 and one that said 30, but in each case, only one, so I recommend setting 20 as the lower limit. But back to my original subject. Television and many a magazine article are very quick to explain that it tends to be healthier to break up one's food intake into 5 or 6 smaller meals per day, instead of the 3 fairly large ones we usually think of. But what they neglect to mention is that the size of the meal is measured in calories. None of them ever explain how big a meal needs to be to count as big, or how small it needs to be to count as small. So before one can account for the size of a meal, one must understand the concept of a calorie. 1 pound of body fat contains 3,500 calories, but I find that comparison quite ironic, and let me tell you why. A calorie is a measure of energy, specifically the amount of energy which, if converted to heat, can raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. So if one wants to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 2 degrees Celsius, or if one wants to raise the temperature of 2 grams of water by 1 degree Celsius, one needs 2 calories of heat energy. So we're talking about a gram of water, which is a metric measurement, and a degree of Celsius, which is also a metric measurement, in determining what constitutes a calorie. But then we're counting the number of calories in a pound, which is not a metric measurement. Now technically there are 2.2046 pounds in a kilogram, which is much more precise than most of us will ever need to work with. So that makes for about 7,716 calories in a kilogram of body fat. What does this mean? What do we do with this information? How do we use it? Well, I'll show you. Given that 1 pound of body fat contains about 3,500 calories, that means that if we consume 3,500 more than we expend, we can expect the body to produce 1 pound of body fat to store it. On the flip side of that, if we can expend 3,500 more than we consume, we can expect to lose 1 pound, on average that is. So how can we keep a clear picture of how much we're taking in and how much we're expending? Well, that's a good question. It can get a little tricky. The healthy rate of weight loss is 1 or 2 pounds per week, but it's better to aim for just 1. Patience demanding, I know, but it is better this way. When one pushes 2 pounds or more, that usually signals to one's physiology that one is going through a food crisis in which there is a real danger of starvation, so the system sets in motion several mechanisms for conserving calories, thus lowering one's metabolic rate. It's much better, really, to stick to just 1. That adds up, though. Think about it. If you can keep it up for a year, that's 52 pounds, and that year is going to pass whether you spend it this way or not. Besides, when it comes to weight management, slower results like that one are more likely to last, since they result from a change in one's habits, instead of some combination of drastic, unsustainable measures. So how can one be sure that one is going to lose 1 pound in a week's time? Well, first you have to account for basal metabolic rate. A lot of health clubs have equipment that can measure that directly, but unless one is a rare case, one can probably make do with a general approximation. There are equations for calculating what one's basal metabolic rate probably is based on one's height, weight, and age. Be careful though, because there's one equation for men and one for women. One day, quite a while ago, out of curiosity, I plugged my figures into both. The male figure was about 2,000, and the female figure was about 1,500. I find that approximately that's the norm for people in their late teens and 20s. What does that mean? Well, if I'm in a coma in the hospital being sustained by an intravenous hookup, and elsewhere in the same hospital is a woman the same height, weight, and age, in the same condition, it means that the IV should probably feed me 500 calories per day more than it feeds her. If it feeds both of us 2,000 calories per day, she will run a daily excess of about 500, which adds up to a weekly excess of about 3,500, which means she will gain 1 pound per week while my weight will remain unchanged. If, on the other hand, it feeds both of us 1,500 calories per day, I will run a daily shortage of about 500, which adds up to a weekly shortage of about 3,500, which means I will lose 1 pound per week while her weight will remain unchanged. This is part of the reason why so many women have a tendency to start gaining weight after they get married. Once married, they start eating with their husbands, and without realizing it, they start eating husband-sized portions. So in a world of abundant food, especially unhealthy food, women really do have a more difficult task when it comes to managing their weight. It's unfair. and unfortunate, and for whatever it's worth, ladies, I regret it. But it's true. Another unpleasant, unfair, regrettable fact is that we live in a society in which women are more pressured to control their weight, while receiving the same amount of pressure to resort to comfort foods, and the one aggravates the other. So not only is the task more difficult for them, but they are more expected to carry it out. When I started studying fitness, I kind of resented the fact that the literature was geared mainly toward women, but in light of these last two facts, and others, I understand. This is a greater problem for women, and the idea is to address their insecurities. One of either gender tends to be a lot less insecure about something once he or she has the cold hard facts about it. Cold hard facts, while they can be inconvenient, deflating, and unsettling, can also be empowering. Now I use the comparison of two people in comas mainly for simplification, just to illustrate the concept of basal metabolic rate. People who aren't in comas tend of course to be at least a little more active, and so expend more calories, and that can complicate one's numbers. But almost no one expends more than 500 calories per day on these exertions without deliberate effort to that end. So if you want to keep it simple, keep it to 5 300-calorie meals per day, one every 3 to 4 hours, and each day do something active. It doesn't have to be something really vigorous and grueling. You don't need to train as a marathon runner or lug a 40-pound pack 5 miles, but get together with some friends and go for a walk on your lunch break or something along those lines. Make it fun. Make it social. After all, the effective routine is the one you can find the motivation to keep doing. I would also advise one to think in terms of health, not appearance. The optimal health body fat range for men is 10 to 20%, while for women it's 16 to 26%. The optimal athletic performance range is 8 to 9 for men and 12 to 15 for women. Meanwhile, the optimal Hollywood range for both is 6%. Unfortunately, I can't illustrate in this video how to calculate one's body fat percentage. For that, you will have to do your own research, but you're better off doing that anyway. Bear this in mind when you see some fitness guru, whatever guru means, pushing the latest gizmo. If you don't know what you're doing, it won't help you. But if you do, you can get a decent workout with almost anything. Either way, you're better off spending your money on something else.